Hello everyone, it's DL back with chapter 3 of Mirage. When we left off, Sadira was speaking with Charity about how she came to be a lifelong resident of Delta Grove. She's telling her now how to withstand the Averys and how to live a reasonably normal life, if that can be possible there on the plantation. So let's jump right in. When all was said and done, Charity's advice to Sadira was to take the good with the bad and the bitter with the sweet. She told her to enjoy the comforts of her own room, nice clothes, fine food, and gifts that would eventually be hers if she refrained from fighting Harlan's advances. To remind her of this, her advisor and newfound mother figure gave Sadira a set of jade earbobs that she had been given years earlier by Harlan's granddad. The two became closer than they had ever been after that overwhelming conversation. Sadira never had the chance to meet her grandmother, but she imagined they would have had dialogues about her past also if she had grown up in Senegal like her mother. She had become very attached to her newfound grandma, but like each episode of her life, the relationship didn't last long. Charity retired to the slave cabins and died only a few months after her working days had ended. The news of her death pierced Sadira to her core. At the same time she was told about Charity, she also received an upsetting report about Abraham. Having quickly grown weary of seeing and receiving harsh treatment on Delta Grove, he and several other slaves plotted and carried out their escape from the plantation. Although a few made it to the north and then on to Canada by posing as free blacks, Abraham and others were not as fortunate. Upon being captured and returned to the captivity of Harlan Avery, no time was spared before punishments were extended. Depending on the extent of their infraction, as decided by Harlan and his overseers, some were slashed with blades, assailed and bitten by dogs, and blasted with buckshot. One woman, who was 5 months pregnant, having been erroneously named the coordinator of the escape, had her hands tied behind her back, was bent over a well with a log placed under her stomach, and was whipped. After 3 overseers took turns delivering over 100 lashes, she miscarried and was left permanently disabled. Abraham received 39 lashes a day for 4 days and then was dismembered. By the end of that week, he had 2 fingers on his left hand and the toes of his right foot amputated. At the beginning of the following week, he was sent back to the fields to resume his work. The worst penalty was endured by a young boy of only 15 years. He begged the others to allow him to join them after years of physical and sexual abuse at the hands of one of the overseers. He had been regularly beaten and thrashed by the supervisor and a group of his friends that were regular visitors to Delta Grove. After each torturous session, members of the group would take turns raping him. It wasn't the first time he had run. His desire for freedom far outweighed the certain penalty he would endure if captured. Each time he was caught, the young boy would undergo some sort of sadistic abuse, and then the rapes and beatings continued. This particular incident cost him his life, and no one could identify the manner in which he died. When Master Avery asked about his slave's death, the overseer, the same one who had continually tortured him and was ultimately responsible for murdering him, told Harlan he must have died of scurvy because his body was swollen so badly that he hardly recognized him. Nothing more was mentioned regarding his life or his death. As a decade passed, Sadira tried earnestly to hold on to the counsel she had been given, but try as she might, she was never able to accept this life as the blessing Charity pretended it to be. She submitted not for gifts or lavish quarters, but only to minimize the beatings. Sadira knew that they had taken a toll on her both physically and emotionally. Whenever she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror, she looked beyond the velvet soft skin and feathery middle-parted hair that gave her such a unique refinement. She could only see a woman who appeared aged beyond her 26 years, and she was fully aware that it was worry and fear, compounded with physical misuse, that affected her appearance. Though inimitably beautiful, the embodiment of melancholy was found right there in her eyes. Just as she had done for the last 10 years, at 5 minutes to 4, Sadira placed the last dishes in the dining room. At exactly 4 o'clock, Miss Avery took her seat at one end of the long mahogany table, and her husband followed suit at the opposite end. They bowed their heads, and Harlan led them in prayer. Sadira had witnessed him praying many times, and for the life of her couldn't comprehend how he claimed to serve the same God that she and Elizabeth served. They were such opposites. It was beyond Sadira's sensibilities how Mr. and Mrs. had ever come to be man and wife. Of course, she had no way of knowing that, like everything else in the life of an Avery man, business and money were the groundwork of that marriage. In fact, any association established by a male Avery was business-driven. Sadira pondered the scripture she had been taught. The love of money is the root of all evil. Well, if money was the root, she reflected sarcastically, Harlan and his forefathers must have planted the seeds. The daily, tight-reined routine had become overwhelmingly mundane, and Sadira didn't know how long she could go on this way. She heard murmurings from other domestics in the main house about slaves all over the South escaping their plantations, and wondered briefly if she had the courage to run. For her, it seemed that if she fled, she would at least have a chance at living a different life. She would have an opportunity to exist without pain and fear day in and day out. Even if she were caught, Sadira rationalized, her certain death would only be hastened. If she stayed, her fate would be akin to Charity's. She would continue to be assaulted and tortured by Harlan and humiliated by his friends and family. She would continue to put on an act for Elizabeth so that the extent of her husband's masochism and misogyny would remain covert. She would cook and clean in the main house for the next half-century and then go to the cabins to die at 80. This was not a destiny for which Sadira longed. She felt trapped. She was trapped. Sadira envisioned sharing these thoughts with her mother and could almost hear the response in her thick Wolof accent. "Child, just take it for Jesus, and you'll understand it by and by." Exiting the dining room, she smiled inwardly and yielded to inspired warmth as she imagined being wrapped in her mother's billowy arms once again. The thought alone fostered an unbounded sense of peace, and for the moment, her spirit was at rest. On a balmy Saturday afternoon filled with nature's sounds and sunshine, Harlan took an uncommon respite from the plantation offices. He lounged lazily on a white rattan chair, feeling rays that beamed onto the wraparound porch through overhung and overspread ivy. A profound and rather irritating egoist by nature, even in a restful state, his entire being reeked of conceit. Just at the point where he was lost in delirious wonder and near sleep, he was roused by the sound of Elizabeth dragging and positioning a seat by his. Failing to conceal agitation and grasping a sweated glass of lemonade now slipping from his hand, he laboriously turned toward his wife. "Harlan, can you spare a moment?" Elizabeth asked with an acute note of distress in her voice. "Of course, my heart. You seem troubled." He feigned concern. "I am troubled, Harlan. I'm worried that I'll never have a child. Years have come and gone. I've watched your cousins marry and start families. I don't know what's wrong. It's like God is punishing me." "You're overthinking again, Elizabeth." "Don't tell me I'm overthinking," Elizabeth interrupted. "Who's going to take over the plantation when we're gone? Who's going to carry on the family name? Trouble? Yes, I am troubled, Harlan. I really am." "Elizabeth, I can't say these thoughts haven't crossed my mind. I certainly need an Avery to carry things along here on the Grove, but I promise you, I haven't lost not one good night's sleep over it. Now, what will be is going to be, and that's all of it. Child or no child, Delta Grove will live on. You better believe I'll see to that. This land has got my daddy's and my granddaddy's blood on it, and his daddy's before him. Now, don't you worry your pretty head. Don't you give it one more thought. You hear me now? Do you hear me, Elizabeth Avery? Not one more thought." "I hear you, Harlan," Elizabeth answered in exasperation. "I'll see you at dinner, 4 o'clock, as usual," she grumbled sardonically. She walked away totally unconvinced that her husband was the least bit concerned about her plight. The passion in his voice when the future of Delta Grove was mentioned, and the lack thereof when their family was the focal point, was very telling. It was his work that drove him. It was his work, not his spouse, that was most vital. Elizabeth had longed for many years to be first in his life, yet she knew it was only a pipe dream. She had entered their union with the purest intentions. She became what her father-in-law said she needed to be in order to carry the Avery name. She forsook her own desires and dreams for her future in order to sustain her husband and adhere to his wishes. Her love was genuine, while Harlan's was lukewarm and selfish. At this point, Elizabeth put away hopes of an authentic relationship with him. She wanted a child now, someone to nurture and provide the only truth that would ever come out of her marriage. For as long as they had been married, Elizabeth had never felt connected to Harlan. Growing up, she saw a bond between her mother and father. Troubles came their way but never affected the relationship. They were the best of friends. Elizabeth longed for friendship at home. Throughout her time on Delta Grove, the servants were her only friends. Their children were her children. She was happy being around each of them, but when her husband entered the house, a sense of desolation and disillusionment followed. The two who had vowed to love each other and forsake all others were essentially strangers. Delta Grove was Harlan's abode. The business of Delta Grove was essentially his wife, and Elizabeth was an utter outsider. Harlan sat back in his chair once again and attempted to rest. Heavy perspiration caused his tawny hair to stick to his square, ruddy forehead. Even his red-brown mustache was saturated with a salty moisture. It was a sure bet that Harlan would never be mistaken for Adonis. Moreover, he couldn't be awarded for his hygienic prowess. The package of mediocrity that was Harlan Avery was completed by chock full of vignettes confirming he wasn't the sharpest knife in the drawer when it came to daily dealings. It seemed that all he knew to do well was make money off of slave labor. His father taught him the art of the trade, and he had inherited all that he had. He needed only maintain what he had already been established on the Grove. Despite attaining success by lineage, Harlan lived in his own self-absorbed reverie. He was born to a spirited and obtuse patriotism common amongst antebellum slavery apologists, and was immensely oblivious to the unjustifiable haughtiness that entwined every fiber of his being. He gave very little thought to the feelings of others and excused his iciness by claiming it necessary to sufficiently execute partisanship, supremacy, and valor. In this instance, however, he thought of his conversation with Elizabeth. Had her words come from anyone else, he would have dismissed them without consideration. Now his heart rebuked him, and he pondered what he could possibly do to relieve her pain. He slumped back in his chair and closed his eyes. After what seemed an eternity of resolutions, doubts, and indecisions pervading his mind, the imposing gravity of that moment acquiesced to the persuasive heat of the day, and Harlan fell into slumber. As the afternoon progressed, Elizabeth became maddened. Her life was nothing like she had imagined as a young girl still stirred by fairy tales and flights of fancy. When she was a child, she dreamt of her wedding day and the home she would live in and the tall, handsome husband that would love her unconditionally. Amid the countless daydreams of her youth, a vision of living on the plantation, harboring slaves, and Harlan as a husband never came into view. It was true that her house was beautiful. This couldn't be disputed. But it wasn't a home. How could it be considered a home when its very existence relied on depriving others of making one for themselves? How could it be a home when her definition included children of her own? This wasn't what Harlan had promised her. 15 years before, when Elizabeth was only 14, Mordecai Avery, Harlan's father, arrived unexpectedly one day at her family residence. They were well aware of his identity, as he was the wealthiest man in the region. An Arkansas luminary, most would agree. As well, rumors had it that his son, the sole heir to the Avery estate, was ready to claim a wife. What they didn't know was that even though they lived miles east of Delta Grove Sugar Plantation, their properties were essentially attached. The empty fields that Elizabeth and her siblings used to romp and play with were actually owned by the Averys. Mordecai approached Elizabeth's father, chest poked out almost comically, one hand gripping his lapel and the other gripping a huge tobacco pipe. Without removing the massive appendage from his mouth, he began stating his business, speaking out of the side of his mouth through clenched teeth. "Mr. O'Shea, I have a proposition for you," Mordecai assertively declared as he dismounted his stallion. "Listen, I understand your financial, substructure, if you will," he continued after falsely clearing his throat. "It's not as sound as it could be or should be. I reckon I could change all that in the twinkling of an eye with some simple cooperation on your part. Liam O'Shea and his wife Ilga had migrated to the United States from Ireland in 1822, the same year in which they were married. They arrived at Castle Garden in New York excitedly optimistic about the future. Life had expanded before them, enthralling and assorted as the open road. Liam aimed to work on the Erie Canal construction project, and Ilga, who was already very skilled at indentured servitude, would obtain work in a local household. Liam was completely against his wife's choice to revisit work as a servant. He knew that thousands of female immigrants from their country were looked down upon, and he cringed at the thought of seeing his wife degraded as a maid, cook, or caretaker. He was aware that he would be treated poorly. As the man in the family, he had already reconciled that he would take that backlash for the sake of their future in America. They had come from a town where everybody worked together. There were different families, but they all worked as a unit. They didn't have much, and they often experienced bouts of poverty and famine at home. But they were surprised to find that not only would they endure much of the same poverty, but they would be discriminated against and forced into hardship all over again. While he was aware that prejudice would be a factor, it didn't truly strike him deeply until he heard one of his bosses mockingly retort, "Let Negroes be slaves, and if not Negroes, let Irishmen fill their place." Though distressing for Liam, Ilga was hired as a nanny in the home of one of the canal engineers, but only a few months after being hired, she became pregnant. Her boss, not wanting her children to grow attached and then be damaged by her leaving months later, let Ilga go. In Liam's case, less than a year after his work began, he suddenly fell ill with fevers, chills, headaches, and nausea. Because he was working near Montezuma Marsh, his manager prematurely assumed he had contracted malaria and immediately had him replaced. It turned out that Liam had a simple virus brought on by exhausting 12-hour work days in harsh conditions, as well as inadequate nourishment and weather exposure. It seemed that all hope was gone for the newlyweds when, seemingly out of nowhere, a new opportunity presented itself. One of the developers from the canal project had completed his portion of the work and acquired another contract. There was a new territory in the South called Arkansas that was establishing its capital, La Petite Roche, also known as Little Rock. Two attorneys, Robert Crittenden and Chester Ashley, had asked him to construct a building where they would practice law. This developer, who had been impressed by Liam's hard work and attention to detail, asked him to join the team. The opportunity couldn't have come at a better time. They arrived in Arkansas in late 1823, and on New Year's Day, 1824, they welcomed their first child, a plump, rosy-cheeked baby girl. The couple believed so strongly that the Lord would always make a way for them that they named their daughter Elizabeth, meaning "My God is a vow." Ilga's favorite story from the scriptures was about John the Baptist's mother, Elizabeth. She was always moved to worship when she read how Elizabeth had been barren, and both she and her husband were old. They trusted God. They were righteous and obeyed His commandments. One day, while ministering in the temple, Zechariah, her husband, was visited by the angel Gabriel and told that a son would be born to them. He was assured they would be filled with joy and gladness. Ilga loved that Elizabeth had been blessed and was rewarded because of her faith. She and Liam read the story to each other often during their voyage to the United States, and even more frequently when their hardships in New York began. They believed wholeheartedly that the Lord would see them through and bless them with the desires of their heart, just as He had blessed Elizabeth and Zechariah. They had made a vow to Him to always love and serve Him, and they believed that He too had made a sacred vow with them. Their relocation, Liam's employment, and their beautiful baby girl were proof positive that their God was indeed their vow. As time went on in their new home, the blessings kept flowing. Before Liam's team had even completed construction at the law office, other proprietors had contracted the team to build places of business for them also. What should have been one assignment turned into steady work for many years, and it afforded the O'Sheas the opportunity to purchase land. Liam built a modest home, and their family continued to grow. They were not wealthy by any means, but they were quite comfortable. With the addition of each child, however, the comfort waned progressively. They often struggled financially, but they were never lacking in love, and that carried them through some of their leanest days. Now once again an unexpected prospect emerged, this time by way of one Mordecai Avery. "I won't go round the mulberry bush with this thing," Mordecai announced. "I aim to expand my plantation, and frankly, need your property to be able to do that. Mordecai had this way of emphasizing words that he deemed vital for the listener. That, combined with his strong southern drawl, caused a near comedic effect. Distracting at best, it caused others to fight riotous laughter when dialoguing with him. I'm thinking that it would benefit us both if I could, encroach upon your land a bit and reward you for your hospitality. I will, of course, need to do away with your house, but I will finance and oversee building you another one that will better fit your, family. Oh, I appreciate the gesture, Mr. Avery, but I worked very hard for what I have, and I won't just let you tear down what I built with my bare hands. Liam interrupted, looking down at his calloused palms with pride. Now, hold on. Just hold on. That's not the whole of it. See, my son will be, needing a wife soon. There's a certain standard that we Averys must uphold, and frankly, I think it's easier to, craft this woman instead of burning daylight trying to find the right one. From what I hear, your oldest Elizabeth has a good reputation around these parts. Yes, she does, Avery, and she doesn't need to be crafted, shaped, molded, or anything else. Her mother and I have raised her to be a fine young lady, and you will not come around here insulting us because we don't have the bankroll you have. I invite you to leave my land now, Avery. Mordecai felt a curious and inexplicable uneasiness come over him. On one hand, he was uncomfortable because no one had ever spoken to him that way. On the other, for the exact same reason, he felt an intriguing respect and didn't know how to respond in the moment. Now just hold your horses, Mr. O'Shea. I didn't mean to insult you. That's the last thing I intended to do. I do have an interest in the land. I'm not going to lie to your face. I just think that, well, just hear me out, please. Mordecai nearly choked on his own words when that last subtlety escaped his lips. You have certainly raised your girl right, and that's a fact. I think she would make a proper wife for my boy, and I think that a proper education would put the icing on the cake that you and your wife have already, baked. You get me? I'm listening, Liam replied curtly. Mordecai continued apprehensively. Yes, like I was saying. A good education will do her, it would do anybody good, not just her, no, not just her. So in exchange for your land, if you, consider it, I will ensure she receives a proper education. Then upon her finishing school, she and my Harlan will marry. You and your wife can remain on the property, and you and your other children will be given employment when they come of age if they so choose. Now, I know your fortune hasn't been supreme, but even a blind hog finds an acorn now and then. Consider this to be your acorn, O'Shea. Don't let it roll away. Just think about it, and I'll be back directly for your answer. Just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone, a cloud of lingering dust leaving the only evidence of his visit. Liam stood bewildered. Ilga soon joined him, and he lovingly placed his arm around her shoulders. What was that all about? I never thought we'd get a visit from someone of Avery caliber. Oh, my Ilga, I don't think caliber is the proper word for Mordecai Avery. I was taught humility and good manners. It doesn't seem he received that same, education, Liam mocked humorously. The next day, Mordecai returned. In the preceding hours, unbeknownst to the elder Avery, his son had visited Elizabeth and her parents. He explained to them that he was aware of his father's plans and that he was in agreement, not for cause of business, but because he had a true affinity for Elizabeth. He shared that he wanted to marry her when she was graduated, and that he would ensure that all of their lives were gratifying. He further expressed that from that point on, in his mind, they were already family, and he would regard them as such. True to his word, Mordecai returned the next day, and Liam told him that they would accept his offer. Harlan's father thought they had sealed another deal, but it was Harlan himself that made the difference. For the next few hours, they discussed plans for the land, the building of their new house, and the school that Liam's daughter would attend. When they began to speak about Elizabeth, Mordecai witnessed the benign look of a father alter the stern lines in his future in-law's face, and he was moved. It was something he had not experienced in his family. He never knew that his heart longed for and needed that kind of love from his own father. From Liam's standpoint, the deepest wants and aspirations of his soul were becoming reality. He could not wait to get word back to Ireland and let his and Ilga's parents know about their granddaughter. She was going to be a college graduate in America, and she was engaged to the heir of the wealthiest family in the state. Yes, indeed, he thought, my God is a vow. When Elizabeth completed her upper classes, she left for Massachusetts to begin studies at Mount Holyoke Female Seminary. Harlan stayed in Arkansas, receiving an education of his own. Although his was more rudimentary, he was taught all aspects of running a plantation as well as the process of sugar refining and sales. Somewhere between his conversation with the O'Shea family and the years that his intended was away, Harlan became a different man. When Elizabeth returned, she was 19 years old, well-educated, sophisticated, and ready for marriage. Harlan, on the other hand, had become a replica of Mordecai. His morals had diminished and compassion faded. Money was his reason for being, and no one or nothing was greater than wealth. It was his motivation and first love. The couple wed, but their life together was nothing even close to what Harlan had described years earlier. Elizabeth knew that something had to change. She just didn't realize that change was in view, bright as the coming forth of the morning, but in the cloud of an early rain. Thanks for tuning in to Chapter 3 of Mirage. We'll see you again very soon for Chapter 4 and see what in the world Mordecai is up to, what Harlan is up to, and what kind of shenanigans he can get in. Hopefully there'll be a change in view. We'll see. You never know. Stay tuned for Chapter 4. Thanks again for tuning in, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.